Friends, you are getting close to single digits. We are one away from my top 10 players of the 50 most relevant for 2025. And on this episode, we're talking about Tom Green. It is the closest to Josh Kelly we're going to get on this year's 50 most relevant. He had a knockout start to 2024, a little bit of a challenging middle patch, and stormed home in 2024. But what does this coming season deliver for us? And just how relevant could he be for us in 2025? We're going to talk about that and more on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me is a man that I'm about to put him on double duty, just so he knows you're coming back again tomorrow, mate. The message has been sent out loud and clear. Tom Green is who we're talking about today. And there is a world where this could be one of the best fantasy midfielders in the game if one or two things go his way.
I mean, he's a fantastic scorer for a guy who's, only 22, 23 years old? 24 years old. Anyways, doesn't matter. He's still a fantastic scorer, and he should be the one that has the keys to that GWS midfield. And like you said, it only needs a couple of things to go his way, and I'm very keen to discuss those things with you.
As you should be. A seasonal average of 99 in AFL Fantasy last year means for that format and Dream Team, he is just over the $1 million mark. Not by much, but he does sneak into the seven-digit territory. And a 106.6 last year in SuperCoach. Not as big as some might have thought, and not as bad as other might have thought, but a $574,200 price point. 159 was his highest SuperCoach score last year. While it's a little bit skinny of what his career high best, it's a 164 against the Swans. He did that back in 2022. While in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, his season high score last year was a 145 against North Melbourne. The year prior is a career high score of 170 against the Western Bulldogs. Mini, for a long time now, while he's only been on an AFL list for a handful of years and been fantasy relevant for the last couple, I think it's felt like a really long time that Tom Green has not just sat in the relevancy space, but we've just been so familiar with what he is, a contested beast, that if there is a 50-50 ball to be won, you're betting on him to be able to do that. Alongside this strong contested capacity that he's got, he's developed this endurance about him now and this work rate about him now that he gets from multiple contests. He gets himself involved in uncontested ball. And while they're not pretty, he does find a way to kick goals. They are not generally just floating through from a snap in a stoppage inside forward 50, but who cares? They're bonus points for us from a fantasy perspective. For a guy that's got no question marks about his role, he does a lot right that fantasy footy coaches love.
Absolutely, he does. You know, we talk about a player being able to find the ball a lot, being able to kick, being able to mark, being able to tackle, being able to kick goals. He does the whole lot. You look at his stat sheets after a game and you say, got 10 to 15 handballs, got 10 to 15 kicks, he got 3 or 4 marks, he got 4 or 5 tackles, he maybe kicked a goal. It's a nice even spread, builds a good base, allows him to have those pop scores that you talked about, you know. Talking about a guy that has hit a 170 AFL fantasy in his career. That's nothing to slouch at. He still managed to hit a 145 in 2024 as well. These are pretty good scores for a player that's coming in priced under 100 in AFL Fantasy and just a touch over 100 in SuperCoach as well. And it's starting to reflect in his ownership as well. In AFL Fantasy, 5th most selected mid, 14th premium mid, I should say, at about 14%. In SuperCoach, he's about the 6th most selected, depending on where you draw that barrier. He's at about 11% as well. So people are definitely queuing in. I think there's a couple of things that we can talk about with him as to why he's coming in that cheaply and why that ownership isn't closer to 20 to 25%. Because if you look at his 2023 seasons in AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach, you're talking about a guy who's done 111 SuperCoach and is coming in priced at 106, and a guy who's done 111 AFL Fantasy and is coming in priced just that touch under 100. So, where do you want to start?
I think it's just a reminder of his ability to score in all the columns. which is not normative for a footballer. We've got players that we've handled through this 50 most relevant that it's a heavy stoppage is where they're scoring, and that is it. It's a heavy transition scorer or a heavy disposal scorer, and that's kind of it. Green is almost the perfect midfielder for us in the sense he's top 5 in the league for contested possessions, handballs, and total disposals. Top 20 in the league for clearances, stoppage clearances, effective disposals, centre clearances, and uncontested possessions. So a commonality of scoring columns that don't normally sit together, but with Tom, they do. 12 tons in fantasy last year, still 7 over 120, despite not hitting that 100 average, and there is a key reason for it. While the 13 tons last year in SuperCoach and 6 over 120. The core reason was he hurts his ankle in round 8. Single-digit score across the formats. That really hamstrings your average over the year. But it wasn't just a one-game isolation, takes a little bit of a break, comes back, and is cherry ripe. He comes back and plays through, despite getting subbed out in the first few minutes of round 8. Comes back and plays round 9, doesn't miss any game of football, but clearly doesn't seem to be anywhere near his peak best. Not just from a fantasy perspective where there's no tons, or a SuperCoach perspective where there's just the 1 ton between then and his eventual rest at the bye. Just go back and watch some of that footage. He's not quite spreading from contest to contest the way that we had seen previously. And then you get some more challenging matchups in there too. It starts to stack up for a challenging reason. But then the final 10 games of the year, Mini, he starts to reflect back to that 2023 seasons that you reflected. The final 10 games of the year. He goes on a 108.6 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team and a 109.5 in SuperCoach. This is showing he is a 110 mid across the formats. When there is no obstacles in his way, this is one of the best midfielders we could get our hands on.
You talk about that 10-week run to end the season as well. It's also in that 10-week run, he doesn't drop below 80 in AFL Fantasy, and he doesn't drop below 90 in SuperCoach. This is the type of thing that we're talking about with someone like Tom Green. Is, we talk about with our starting premiums, you want players that have got high ceiling and a high floor. And he clearly has that. Most of his low scores, both in SuperCoach and in Fantasy, came either in that injured game, single digits, or in the 5 games following on from that. The only exception to that was a round 5 game against the Saints. And what do you know? He goes 72 AF, 72 SuperCoach. It's not the end of the world. It's not fantastic. But if you look back at his 2023 season as well, he has 1 game below 80 in AFL Fantasy and 1 game below 80 in SuperCoach. It's against the Hawks. He got a lot of attention. Connor Nash is the player that's just going to stand next to him, just to say, hi, I'm here. I might give you a tackle every now and then, but my job is going to be to try and limit the amount of damage you can do with the ball. But there's other players on that GWS team that will cop a harder tag if they need to. And, the likes of Whitfield when he cops a tag from someone like Finn McGuinness, or when he cops a tag from someone like James Jordan. So the tag isn't the big concern. We now know, yes, he's got a high floor. Yes, he's got a high ceiling. Yes, his scoring trends throughout the 2024 season are very explainable in terms of why he's coming in underpriced. It's primarily due to that injury game. You say that to someone, you go, right, fantastic. Why is no one else picking him?
All aboard, yeah.
And then the AFL comes out and says, oh, we're going to use this thing called opening round again.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, we're going to do it again. And he cops the worst buy to be able to have. Probably not the worst buy, but you get to see him for essentially 1 game of him before he plays. You get 1 game of him during the regular season, and then he's got a buy. And so I think that's where we need to frame the conversation around Tom Green. Is even with that early buy, is he worth picking, or are you just going to be considering him after the buy? I want to hear your thoughts on this, MJ.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think part of it is, how do you go about building your starting squad? Because Tom Green's the kind of guy to me that the early buy will turn some people away from him. They go, I get the look in the Magpies game. I actually get the Demons score, and then I'm in a week where everybody else has a potential most available premiums, or what I'm paying for in premium. I'm choosing to opt out of that, because the difference between this year and last year outside of a couple of variables, was you got 2 bites of the cherry before he goes out. This year, it's just you get the one hit, and then you're back of the pack with everybody else. To me, I don't think his round 2 bye is enough of a reason to be the reason I don't start him. Now, it can be a final informational factual piece where you're like, it's this, and the bye. I put them together and I don't select him. Fine, different story. But to me, if you go, I don't want to start him because he's a premium and he's got one of those, well, he has the first bye. To me, I just go, it might almost be the best bye, because of which premium midfielders in our bye structures, looking through those first 3 weeks, this should be the easiest to navigate. This should be the one that if you're going to load up on a top-end mid, and I don't think he's top-end in price, but top-end in his output, this is the week to be able to do it. There are some really nice matchups for mid prices in the second week that can really be strongly looped if you wanted to do that as well. So to me, the early season buy is not a deterrent anymore. It can be a factor, but it shouldn't be the factor when it comes to considering Tom Green, in my opinion.
And the other thing is the mid prices and the rookies that you get to look at. Let's say you only have 2 or 3 mid rookies on field, and after round 1, we say, oh my gosh, these are guys who can all score 70s. Well, great. You can have a loop at that in your midfield when no one else has that opportunity, because as it stands right now, the rookies that we're likely to get from Gold Coast and GWS that are on that round are either going to be in our forward line or in our defensive line. And Tom Green would basically be the only midfielder from either of those teams that people are considering strongly. Some people might be looking at a Noah Anderson and saying, I think I can go for him. But I think if you're looking at a Noah Anderson, I think Tom Green is as viable an option. But then the other thing is, yes, he has that round 2 bye, but then he doesn't have another bye all the way until round 16.
Correct.
I think the last bye round that you have to be able to have a player play. And you look at who else is on that bye round in terms of teams. You got a Brisbane Lions, so maybe you're looking at a Neil, maybe you're looking at a Dunkley. You got a Geelong, it's probably not a midfield that you're looking at. There's an Essendon where you may be considering a Merritt as being a top 8, and you've got GWS where you've got a Tom Green. I don't see people starting either of the Lions boys. I see some people starting a Merritt, but I think a lot of people are considering trading into him rather than starting him. So locking away and squaring away a midfielder on that round 16 bye that also has the round 2 bye, but might be one of your only players on that bye, it's not exactly that much of a deterrent. Now, we also want to have a look at the fixture around that particular bye as well. And yes, you've already alluded to it. They do start off with Collingwood in opening round, which is a relatively friendly matchup. It's something that we can use to look at the role of Tom Green, but the thing is, I don't think anyone's particularly concerned about the role. I think we know that he's going to be an 80% CBA midfielder. He might rotate forward every now and then, but the role isn't the concern. We just want to see a score. Round 1 against Melbourne, it's a pretty nice fixture. He should do reasonably well. There's the bye. Then there's the round 3 game against Hawthorn. And this is the one where people are probably scratching their heads a little bit thinking, do I really want to own him for that when Nash is going to stand next to him? Who knows? Who knows? He could come out with an 80. He could have come out with 110. It's down at Pig Park. He could find a way to get absolutely off the chain. We've seen players be able to do that. But the juicy fixture is the week straight after that, whereas against West Coast. And if you really like Tom Green as an option and you think he's a player that can go 110, that is the week you probably want to get on, because that's the week where you expect the highest score, and not just the highest score, also a captainable score from him. So there's a lot of things to unpack with regards to his fixture outside of just the bye for him. But there's enough there where you have to be starting to think, is the only reason I'm discounting him because of that early bye? And if that is the only reason you're discounting him, I think you should really have another look at him, because he's a perfectly viable player to have at that M2, M3, M4 spot, depending on how deep your team is running, alongside a lot of these other value options that people are considering, like a Connor Rozee, like a Tim Taranto, like a Jordan Dawson. He's got the ability to be able to match any of them over the length of the season.
Super coaches and dream teamers, the advantage you might be feeling of, I'm down an option. Well, with the flex available to you, you're not just trying to pick 18 from 22 viable spots. It's 18 from 23. If you're running a deeper mid-price run, potentially through your midfield, let alone forward or defensive lines, really all you're doing is enabling yourself to pick up that extra rookie score that could pop for us. We've talked about with Dylan Alexander on the channel before, and many have made comments in the media landscape before it. This could be one of the greatest crop of midfield draftees we've seen. So getting that opportunity to get another option in there is perfectly fine for you in SuperCoach Dream Team. While in AFL Fantasy, he's not priced at a spot for you, depending on what your risk profile looks like, where if he does okay in opening round, and I don't think his score is what I'm worried about, it's what's happening around him, which I want to get your thoughts on in a sec. If he drops a 90 right in against Melbourne, who's to say he's not the pathway? If Will Day goes off his chain, I've got to go get Will Day. Sam Doherty goes off his chain. He's not the guy. Like, he's not priced at the spot where you're getting into the Dawsons and the Merits where it's like, I'm spending a 105 capital. I've got to give it more than a week here. There's no reason why you couldn't just go, he only got a 90. I've missed Peatling. I've missed Doherty. I've missed whoever. I'm parachuting out of Tom Green. And so even in an AFL fantasy sense, he can become a pivot point for you should you need it. I just don't think the buy, I know it's not ideal, but I think it just creates an option for us to look. And with the value that is there, because I think he's a 110 guy in fantasy. I think he's a 110 guy minimum in SuperCoach, because I've seen an unhindered Tom Green over a 2-year window, the unhindered games, that is what he is. And to get 10 points per game of value in fantasy and 5 points minimum in SuperCoach, I'm keen. But we've talked about the buy. We've talked about navigating it. This GWS midfield is different to what it's looked like over previous eras. Cornelio and Kelly are still perfectly good footballers, but they're not going to be at the peak of their powers. I don't think the departure of Perryman and Cumming do anything other than impact rotations to that side a little bit. But I want to ask you, there's this perception that GWS have a thin midfield. I think Green is the unequivocal, unquestionable move. He's staying there and everything is built around him. But then there's like 5 or 6 names that could all sit through there. There's Cornelio. You do have Kelly. Yes, I got him twice in one podcast. Yeah, me. Bedford played a tagging role. Callaghan, they've talked about and shown they do want him more on the inside, not on the outside. At times, Toby Green has floated in there and does the arrival of the package stringer free that movement up a little bit. And then Brent Daniels last year added some spark in this midfield. Much like we'd seen players like Bolton and Rankin previously be the creative forward small, go into the mid and then push forward. Does this unknown kind of 2nd to 6th midfield option help or hinder Green's fantasy output this year?
When you look at CVA compositions for teams, what you're really looking for is who's going to be playing as the more bulky, in and under, tackling type player, and who have you got as your quick, lightning speed, get it out in the front of the contest as fast as you can, and you want to get the ball into their hands. And you look at that GWS midfield and you say, right, let's say their first CBA, which is probably quite likely, is Tom Green, Cornelio, and Callaghan. Realistically, it's Callaghan and Cornelio that you want to be breaking away from the pack and moving fast, and it's Green that you want to be doing the in and under, hard work, grunt work. I don't see any of these other chop out options really being able to do that. You don't see it. Like, they've lost James Peatling to the Crows. Josh Kelly isn't quite that silky smooth user that he used to be 5 years ago. Callan Ward isn't that player that can just plug and play for 50% CBAs anymore either. When you have a player that does that in and under grunt work and can do it so effectively, you would expect him to be broaching that 85 to 90% CBA marker. And with the way that GWS team is laid out, that's what I expect to see. And I expect to see him probably doing a lot of shoveling the ball inside and outside. What we really want to see from Green to take it from being, say, a safe 110, 115 guy in AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach respectively, to being the pure dominant piggish-like tendencies to being able to go 120, is to lead up, get those +6s, be the one who's saying, this is my ball to have, And if he is the core player inside of that midfield and everything else is being built around him, that's what I expect him to be able to do. That is the evolution to his game that can take it to the next level. If we see him getting the ability to get 5 or 6 tackles, which he innately can do with that 85 to 90% CBA role, and he strings on 3 or 4 kick mark chains, bumps his kick to handball ratio from being about a 0.7 towards a 0.8, 0.85, that's the pathway to upside. And I think that the way that GWS midfield is structured does allow for that to occur.
I do think a healthy Stephen Cornelio helps him significantly too.
Yeah.
We've long loved Cogs in the fantasy community, mostly when he's been forward eligible for us. It's probably been the time we've admired and loved him the most. But I think he helps not only protect Green from being the one-man band, but also gives him that opportunity to get that kick-to-handball ratio at a pretty heavy, much more balanced perspective. So he's not only the extractor. He's not only the first touch at the contest, but he can be using that power in his body to just bulldoze out of any kind of opposition pressure and then kick the ball inside forward 50, which has only got more potent in my eyes with the arrival of a Jake Stringer. You think about the Coleman medalist in Hogan, the opportunist in Toby Green, the absolute greatest definition of roller coaster forward in Jake Stringer, let alone that whizzing whippet group that they've got of Daniels and Jones. This forward line gets really scary. So if he's not only ever having to be first touch football finder, but can be that and be a connector, my goodness me, I think you're right. There's a world where this could get big. I think the only thing to flag is, and I'm curious, maybe more from a SuperCoach perspective here, is last year, top 3 in the league for clangers per game and 10th for turnovers. These are not the stat lines we want to see. I know you watched and have watched him quite closely in person at a lot of games too. It is his way of burning the ball, for sake of a better phrase. It's probably unfair on him, but is that because he's a poor user of the ball, or is he trying to bite off a lot in the game and the variables around how his teammates are working or what he's doing is just a little too cute and too much? Is it one of those particular things or a combination of both?
It's probably a combination of both. I mean, you do expect these sorts of really contested in and under guys to have a few more clangers in a game, just by the nature of every single possession that they have is going to be under a lot of pressure. He is saying that he can definitely tidy up. He has had stretches where he goes on low clanger games, like at the start of the season last year, 1-4-3-4-4. That's pretty good for someone who's playing that sort of inside under role. But then you've got stretches where he goes like 5-3-10-6-7. Like that's 7 a game roughly clangers. That's really going to hamper your score. If he can tidy it up, that might be the difference from him being a 115 type SuperCoach guy to being in that uber elite territory along the likes of Bontempelli and Butters, who just don't clanger the ball quite as much as what he does. And if we start to see those sorts of things, that's definitely a lights on, off we go here, let's jump aboard. I don't know whether it'll change this year. He still has a few years until he hits that magical, mythical 27-year-old inside midfielder being the absolute top of their prime. You look at players like Jordan Dawson, Marcus Bontempelli, Rory Laird, Tuke Miller. At that 27-year-old age is when they tend to have their absolute spike year. With someone like Tom Green, who's been playing inside midfield since day one, that could come sooner. And maybe cleaning up that disposals is what actually does lead to that ability to be the best midfielder technically in the game in SuperCoach. Like there is a world where he is the highest scoring midfielder in AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach in 2025. And that is a scary prospect to go against when you're saying, I don't want to pick this guy just because he has that round 2 bye.
Absolutely. How do we protect that round 2 bye, practically speaking? Because I think that's the hindrance for people. I know we did talk about it, but I want to come back to it. That's the hindrance in picking him, especially in AFL Fantasy, where we just go, even if he maintains some poor efficiency and use perspectives. And again, it's more because of where he's winning the ball, not he's a butcher. It's he's winning it in highly contested situations and bringing the ball forward for his team. So it's not about a poor user. It's he's getting rid of the ball under a lot of pressure. How do we structure our side to protect this? Is there anything about rolling with extra mid prices? Is it how we balance our buy structures? Is there any one or two things you could see that coaches that want to start him but are worried that potentially their second or third most expensive mid is missing in week 2 in correctional trade week? They're already fixing and now they're absent something. Is there any encouragements or this is how you could protect that selection that you can see?
I'd advise coaches not just to look at the downside and say, oh, he's missing round 2, I don't get his score. There are upsides to these sorts of things. If we don't have many rookies that come from GWS or Gold Coast, he might be the only player in your squad of 30 that isn't playing that week and might be the only way you can actually have a look at a loophole on your VCC. Other things to consider are the fact that he can allow you to run a deeper midfield and say, you know what? I'm going to just run 1 or 2 rookies on field. I'm going to park him at M1, M2, M3. And I'm going to have a week where I say, all right, I'm just fielding these 2 rookies for round 1. And then at round 2, you say, I get to look at 2 out of my best 3 midfield rookies. That's not a bad thing to be able to look at. We're talking about the likes of Ashcroft, Foz, Layla, Smiley, Jagger, all being viable options on any given week to start in your midfield. If you can have a crack at that, and let's say one of them pops to 70 and Tom Green, you project it going 110 for the year, it's only a 40-point drop-off. And you might get that back if you actually need the captaincy. Let's say we've got a playing R3, like a Harry Boyd, like an Archer Reed. That's upside actually just inherent in the fact, outside of what Tom Green is doing himself, but what he provides to your structure. So you've always got to be able to not just focus on what the negatives are. I mean, it's quite the reverse of what we do at this time of the preseason, where we're only looking for upside. And Tom Green is definitely a player with upside just built into his price if we project it over the whole season. But you've also got to look at what are the advantages in starting him for my squad actually coming into round 2. And those are a couple of things that kind of do point him to being an option to start at least.
You get the extra look at a Sid Draper potentially, who's got that Essendon matchup as one of the first games on Saturday. I think Sid Draper's a Caleb Sarong clone. And so does that become the game that it really pours out for him? There is one game that really catches my eye on the Sunday afternoon of North Melbourne and Melbourne, where an O'Sullivan, a Langford, a Lindsay. Yes.
I thought you were going to talk about the game just before that.
I'm getting to that.
You've got Brisbane Lions versus West Coast. You're talking about a Levi Ashcroft as well.
Correct, and I am. So there is like 6 or 7 rookies that feasibly we normally wouldn't get a look at. Well, they're here all of a sudden. And so I think he's so highly relevant this year because he's got a narrative for why he's at the price point that he is. And I just don't see, barring injury, him going under 110 in fantasy this year. I know the overall scoring trend of fantasy is going down. I know the overall numbers we're seeing in a pure data sense in fantasy is going down. But I think when you look over the last 2 years, you look at who he is, how he plays, the way under Kingsley the ball moves, and what is sitting around this midfield and how it is now Green's midfield that it's built around, not Kelly, Cornelio as the stars. They are now supplementary to Green. I just don't see in AFL fantasy how he's not 110, and he's an injury-impacted game away from being there already in SuperCoach with 120 potentials if 1 or 2 little understandable things happen in his career, which I think is more closely driven to natural development and a little bit of extra support through that forward line more so than anything else. So to me, the buy should not deter. And I think if that's the only reason you've scrubbed him off your starting squad consideration, I'd actually maybe come back to the marker and have a look at it again.
I think that's about as succinct as we can be on it without rambling on for another 30 minutes about how we don't
you know that's what we're fans
put on
of doing.
Too much overemphasis on the buys. We talk about it, we consider it, and by the time round 0 happens, and if he goes 140, everyone will be like, oh, Tom Green, I wonder if he can slot him into my team. And if he goes 80, it's like, I'll pass him. I was already considering that, but I'll do it for sure now. So
yeah,
I think
so
it's just
true.
up to what we see with opening round now, and I think that,
And what
we'll get what we'll get.
Yep, I agree. On draft day on the Keeper platform, where he goes, well, I think we've got a couple of clues about it. At the coaches panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform for single season Keeper and Dynasty leagues. Unrivaled customizations for Dynasty and Keeper league coaches. One of the most easy things, too easy. In the Keeper league that I'm in several, I have made way too many trades over the last 3 days. They may not be improving my team, but it's just so easy to trade players and picks, and it's just... They're gone. It's unbelievable what Ryan and the team have done there. Make sure you check it out. We draft there. But where do you see him going on draft day on an AFL fantasy scoring platform, whether it be Keeper or another, or in the SuperCoach platform? It's probably a little bit later, but not by much. Where are you taking him on draft day, Mini?
I don't actually think it's that much later in SuperCoach compared to AFL fantasy, but I think it's pretty clear that he's an M1 candidate across the board. I think that aside from that injury that he had with his ankle, and he still played the rest of the season, he's really not been that type of injury-prone player. And he is a player that can push 110 AFL fantasy and 115 to 120 SuperCoach. I don't think I'd take him in the first 5 picks of the draft, but I think if I was a late picker in the first round of a, say, 10-team draft, he would be one that is very much on my radar to be picking towards the end of the first round.
Yeah, mid to late in the first round in AFL fantasy is the sweet spot for him, and late first, early second in a SuperCoach platform, of course, pending on league sizes, positional scarcity, all those variables. That definitely impacts it in. Hey, mate, always a pleasure talking with you about players. Let's bring you back tomorrow. Double duty for me, please. I think you're going to enjoy this one tomorrow, though.
I think I will. I wonder why, though. Ooh. Good to see you.
Oh, he's getting good at the clues. Jordox has taken hosting job on Finders Keeper soon. MiniMonk's going to take care of this. And I will just drift off willingly into the retirement abyss as the old man of fantasy football. If you want to go and check out any of the other players, 40 of them now that we have looked at in the 50 most relevant, make sure you go and check it out. It is sitting on wherever you're checking it out on this platform. The others are there. Go and check them out. If it's an audio podcast platform you're listening on, give us a 5-star rating. Leave a review if you can. We'll read it out in an upcoming podcast, especially if it's a positive one. And if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't subscribed, come on, friend. Help a brother out. Subscribe, get the notifications on, and comment below. What are you doing with Tom Green in 2025? Inside the description of this episode are all the details of where you can get in touch with us on social media, get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch, or become a Patreon. It is a good time to be a Patreon. There is some exclusive, fun, amazing things that they are getting access to. Regardless of the tier level of support, there's a tier that is right for you and a bunch of exclusive content that can and will be available for you. All right, let's hit the number 10 spot tomorrow in my 50 most relevant. You should not be surprised by the names that are left. You should be able to go, right, who haven't we looked at? You should be able to go 10 to 1 and at least write the names. You might not have them in the order I do, but the names shouldn't be familiar. So let's knock out a bunch of those names by saying this. Midfield. He is my predicted M1 in AFL fantasy. I think he'll be the best AFL fantasy mid of 2025. And I think there's a pathway where he can join the likes of Bontempelli, Butters, and go 120. But can he join the likes of a Bontempelli and Butters? Because he already is Bontempelli or Butters. Or is this a new name that could join those two? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.